to today's webinar. We've already had a really rich session earlier this morning, looking at different aspects of the book, and we are expecting more of the same, so you're all very welcome. We have for this session a couple of chapters to look through. First of all, Rohit and I will look through the chapter overview of policing, the new normal. That was written by Katherine van Gurp and Mike Richmond, who, because of the nature of their own work, are unable to take part in the webinar today. We've also then got Bronwyn Williams, who's going to look at her chapter, The Great Separation, and then Dr. Bruce Lloyd, who's going to be looking at the case for new progressive, socially focused economic initiatives. So I'd like to welcome you all back this afternoon, and Rohit, if you'd like to kick us off by introducing the first topic today, this afternoon.
Yeah, so this chapter on Policing the New Normal by Katherine van Gurp and Mike Richmond from the Australia and New Zealand Policing Authority really looks at how does policing change in the world as we come out of the pandemic and beyond. And what they've highlighted is that with both a financial and a health crisis going on, that's actually changed some of the roles of policing. The police are playing a bigger role in healthcare delivery and the management of the population around its health. But also, there's starting to emerge some new roles for them to play around that. So there were 4 key domains they talked about. Steve's going to talk you through the first 2, and then I'll talk you through the 3rd and 4th shifts that they discussed.
Cool, thanks very much, Rohit. So to kick off then, policing the new normal. Really, the chapter focuses on the forces that could shape the new normal of policing in a post-pandemic world. And globally, we know that police have been catapulted into what's become a quite unfamiliar role. At the same time as, you know, they've had to consider the impacts not only of policing any lockdowns, but also thinking about the altered criminal landscape, altered criminal behavior. And of course, the criminal mind is looking at the current pandemic and looking for opportunities as criminals might see. So the first couple of aspects that I just wanted to cover off that Mike and Katherine have spoken about was about people power. And in people power, they talk about communities acting with a collective spirit. So as part of the observation that the police have made, there have been successful strategies that have put in place throughout the pandemic that have actually encouraged communities to act very differently than maybe we've seen in the past. Maybe we do see these kind of behaviors in times of crisis, but it's an interesting observation. The other thing that they talk about as a part of people power is a collective spirit that could possibly endure beyond the pandemic, something that allows us to actually look at, challenge and change social norms. But at the same time, it's clear that there are some social and ethnic divisions that have been deepened. And part of those are about the propensity of certain people, certain populations to the disease. But others are about access to services, access to the kind of products and the sort of things that we might want to do that allow us to protect ourselves and our families. There was also a kind of a dynamic that's starting to shift through the lockdown, particularly about the use of transport and the use as lockdowns start to be lifted of private transport rather than public transport. So there's likely to be a sort of a socioeconomic impact there about how much risk people have to take as they start to get back to work. But increasingly, as private, transport is used, then maybe we'll see an increase in accidents and so on, which police will obviously have to deal with. There's also anxiety about the risk of infections on those crowded public transport. So we need to understand what sort of provisions might be in place. But all these issues, particularly the difference between those that feel more able to cope and those that can't, could lead to a rise in violence and other public order issues. We'll start to see potentially the use of health checks to allow longer distance traveling particularly. And there may be a role for the police and security services certainly in that. So stricter health checks on crews and passengers at airports and aircraft, of course. And other impacts might be the effect that it has on migration and travel patterns. And certainly Mike and Katherine talk about the impact that could have on Australia and New Zealand as holiday destinations. So as leisure travellers, as the number of leisure travellers reduces, then that's going to have a significant impact on the potential of economic growth. Second area I want to talk about is money matters. And obviously this is about the economy and the impact of the economy and the fact that we're all experiencing life-changing stress, and that has an economic impact. Really simple example. I've not filled up my car with diesel for about 9 weeks now. And I've still only done 120 miles. So the economic impact of the lockdown kind of transcends lots of different areas of our normal everyday lives. We're also likely to see a harsher economic impact on women, on younger people, low-income households, and people that seem disproportionately affected by job losses that start to emerge through the pandemic as well. And younger people might perceive an inequality. So it's the younger people that might feel that they have to provide the support for older people through contributions to pensions and so on. So there may be some discordance and disorder amongst that population as well. It's perception of inequity. And inequity across a number of the different areas I've spoken about could manifest itself in a number of different types of public protest. We're also likely to see the impact of reduced funding. Reduced funding as a result of kind of a traditional model, if you like, in the way public services are configured, could mean that whilst police budgets may be maintained, that public service budgets elsewhere are reduced. And that reduction in public services could also lead to increasing criminal activity and public unrest. Rohit, if you take us through the next couple.
So the third of the critical shifts that they identify is what they call the digital diaspora. And here they argue that lockdown has driven many more people online for work, for entertainment. We're spending more and more of our time online. And that actually increases the potential for crime, both for people who weren't thinking about committing crimes before, but suddenly are learning how to commit crimes in cyberspace, but also the general level of crime that's happening because more people are online and there's more cyber risk. And they highlight in particular the risk of child trafficking, where the evidence suggests that that's actually going up during the pandemic. The second aspect of this is the scaling up of cyber risks with phishing attacks, cyber attacks, denial of service attacks, ransomware attacks, and they've identified, again, that around the world, particularly health services and critical services have become more targeted in this time period. The next aspect of this that they've really picked out is how international digital crime has become, that it crosses borders, it knows no jurisdiction, you can do the crime from wherever you are in the world, and you can, sorry, I'm just trying to get myself back on screen, there you go. You can commit the crimes from anywhere in the world, it's very hard to trace, requires a lot more global collaboration to actually deal with these crimes going forward. And then the final aspect of this is that in order to deal with this, not only do police forces have to upskill, have to develop deeper and deeper digital capabilities for the new environment, but also the range of partnerships that they have to enter into is going to grow almost exponentially, whether that's the social media firms, whether that's the big online platforms that are gathering a lot of our data because of our e-commerce behavior or our search behavior, whether that's the big banks and institutions that are becoming more digital, or literally anyone who's accumulating more and more data about the citizen, that the police are going to have to work with these institutions in a more and more robust way, in a more transparent way, and gain the citizen support for using that data in tracking crime and tackling cybercrime. The final area that they touch on is what they call trust talks. And they highlight the fact that many governments have taken to themselves emergency powers during this period, and there will be a question of how quickly those emergency powers are relinquished. There's also the the rise of these contact tracing apps, which again are accumulating huge amounts of data. And finally, the general increasing reliance on tech. All of these issues are talking to the concern the public will have about privacy, about the ability to stay anonymous in the system, the ability to not be surveilled continuously. And that's going to challenge the context in which trust is developed, both by governments, but also the police forces that serve governments and the populace. And they see trust as being one of the critical agendas where the new policing models are going to have to be played out and tested to see how do we build trust in this increasingly digital world where people are suffering all sorts of new strains and pressures as a result of the lockdown. How do you sustain trust? How do you build it? And it couldn't be more timely if we look at what's going on in the States at the moment, where there's this sense that trust has broken down between the police and particular segments of the community. And it's gone beyond trying to use, if you like, the normal channels of protest and trying to use democracy to make a change. The public are taking to the streets in certain ways, and that's challenging the model of how do we police, what role do the police play in this, what role does government play in guiding the police. And it's, you know, almost as if we were given this as a deliberate experiment to look at, well, how do you resolve the kinds of tensions that are going to arise when countries are under the kind of strain they're under right now. It's a fascinating chapter, and I'd certainly encourage you to have a read of it when you pick up the book. We've got a little bit of time for questions. I don't see any questions that have come in yet from the participants. Just a reminder to put your questions into the Q&A box and to vote for the ones you most want to see answered. And then if you put stuff in the chat box, there's a very good chance we're not going to see it because we're sort of focusing on the chat box. So while we're waiting, let's get Steve back up on screen. There you go. Steve, from your perspective, we're seeing very contrasting views about how policing develops in the kind of pandemic era and beyond. We're seeing what's going on in the States. Accusations of heavy-handedness, but also their defense is, well, what else can we do? And then you're seeing other parts of the world where they're saying, no, we police by consent. The UK is a classic example in terms of how we've handled the lockdown and more than two people being out together and all of those things. What kind of model do you think is going to be most appropriate, given all the votes we had earlier about the needs of society? Where does this push us in terms of the kind of policing we need for the kind of society we're talking about creating? You're muted, Steve.
Thank you, Rohit. Well, I suppose you could argue that our experience in the UK has kind of put the police in a very difficult position in that they've been given a set of criteria by which to judge people's behavior, some of which are positioned as direction, others of which are positioned as guidance. And it's the lack of black and white, I think, that's creating such an issue for police. Now, that may well be an issue in the context of UK policing where the focus is policing by consent. And I guess there are other nations around the world where the notion of policing is somewhat different and it's less about consent and more about enforcement. So I think it's a really difficult question, in my mind anyway, to answer on a global basis. But I think it does start to draw into question how police are used around what is basically a health issue. So should the police be able to arrest someone for being sick? Should they be able to arrest someone who is breaking the guidance or the rules around social distancing? And I think one of the interesting things that has come about, particularly over the last week in the UK, is if there are senior people in senior positions in government, for example, even government advisors, as well as members of parliament, what role should the police have in ensuring that they adhere to the rules in the same way that everyone else does? So I think it's a very difficult position for the police to be put in, particularly the more consent-led the policing is.
I agree with you. I think we've seen also that around the world, the models of policing and their attitude towards different segments of society are very, very different. So we've seen in places like India some quite brutal treatment of citizens who they felt weren't locking down, even though they had nowhere to lock down. And I hear that there was a police officer beheaded in India by an angry mob that just didn't want to be told what to do. So that we have a real challenge around how do you modernize the policing model around the world when there are such different contexts in which you operate, such different political perspectives about the role of the police and the extent to which the police are seen as an independent arm to enforce the law, or are they seen as an extension of the government of the day doing the government of the day's bidding? And certainly, you know, we see in the US that the president there certainly is talking as though the police are effectively you know, an extended arm of his presidency doing what he wants them to do. And others are challenging that. And I think this is going to be one of those tension points in the coming years where we see more and more societal tensions around more and more issues, and the police will be caught in the middle. And how they choose to manage that relationship and how they choose to maintain a degree of independence from both the community they serve and the political masters who effectively set the framework in which they operate. I think that's going to be a really tough challenge for police forces. And I could easily imagine a lot of senior police officials being removed or removing themselves in the coming years because it's getting so complicated, and they'll feel like they don't have the freedom to act, or their political masters will say, you're not doing what we want you to do, move on. So I think we're at a really interesting point of tension right now.
Yeah, and the thing that strikes me as well is what we have so far is a set of learnings about, you know, how the policing has happened through the pandemic so far. So if there is a second peak, then I wonder which learnings will be taken forward, and will that kind of consent piece be much more about enforcement, for example, in the UK? You know, and what lessons might we learn from around the world that can then be applied to UK policing? Because, you know, the longer that the pandemic and the crisis goes on and the more peaks of infection there are, then actually the temptation to use the police much more in an enforcement role presumably grows. But at the same time, that we know that community-based policing is one of the critical things to help in particularly deprived areas and in creating kind of connection between authority and particularly local youth. So anything that draws that into question kind of begins to change the notion of how people regard police in those sensitive situations as well.
Excellent. Well, I think it's probably time to bring in Bronwyn and Bruce to talk about their chapters.
I think it is.
Away.
Thanks for that, Rohit. First of all, I'm delighted to introduce Bronwyn Williams. Bronwyn, her chapter is entitled The Great Separation. Bronwyn is a futurist economist and a trend analyst. So Bronwyn, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So my chapter really focuses, it is exactly as it's titled, it focuses on the Great Separation. I think quite a few of the speakers and authors here today have already mentioned that crises like this tend to highlight, exaggerate, and magnify already underlying trends and trajectories going on in society. And I think that many of us that work in the future space or in the political space or in the space of economics understand how fragile our society is right now and how many growing divisions there are just below the surface, this veneer of civilization that we have across the world. And it struck me very much that the media narrative when the crisis first broke was very much a case of we're all in this together, and brands saying we're here for you, and there were wonderful pictures of people in Italy playing musical instruments with their neighbors, and there was a sense of social solidarity, and this would a cohesive crisis, a crisis that enhanced social solidarity. But unfortunately, I think that that narrative has worn thin very, very fast. I think we'd be remiss not to mention that right now, the United States is ablaze. It's literally on fire with race riots, which haven't been seen since the 1960s, which incidentally was when the last global pandemic was actually sweeping across the world. And my chapter doesn't go in so much about these sort of social fragmentation that's going on, although that definitely is a thing. We definitely have seen this as a flashpoint that has highlighted a lot of those underlying tensions. But my chooses to focus more on the economic divides going on in our societies. And I think we need to also really be cognizant of the fact that growing inequality is one of those macro trends that is driving us to a point of crisis in our globalized, capitalist, interconnected world that we have. Many different social studies and pieces of research have highlighted how inequality is one of the most destabilizing forces in the world, both on an international level and on a local level. And what we really have seen with both the responses and the effects of responses from governments, from society to what's going on in the world is that this current crisis is increasing inequalities in a lot of different directions rather than reducing them. And that means that what we really is that we are seeing both a literal and a figurative division, a lack of middle ground in terms of our discourse of what's going on in the world, a lack of middle ground in terms of nuance between different approaches from different governments and different experts to how the crisis should be handled from either its lives or its money, either its lockdowns or it's not at all. Very binary ways of looking at how to solve the problems, and then also a lack of middle ground in the more literal sense, in that to a large extent the middle is being ripped out of the market right now. So the first example I have here, the first section that I look into in the chapter, is very much how the middle size of the corporate market is under threat. So I'm from South Africa, which is already the world's most unequal country in terms of Gini coefficients. So I really do know a lot about how it feels to live in a society where you already have winners that take all, and very much the rest of that whole entire market being very much left behind. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is that businesses, particularly your SMEs, your small, medium-sized and micro businesses, the businesses that were the great hope to reduce inequality, to increase employment, to get more people having a say in the economy in a local and a global sense, are the businesses that are under threat from lockdowns. So now there's research that's come out of my country in South Africa where 3 out of 4 SMEs don't believe they're going to survive the lockdowns, even as those lockdowns are coming to an end right now. This is a tragedy, not just because a whole lot of those entrepreneurs are going to lose their incomes, but also because what it does is once again it puts a bigger divide between the biggest corporations and everyone else. Of course, the bigger companies are the ones that have the biggest paychecks or the biggest bank balances and the most access to cash, and also the most access to government bailouts, which means what we see is big business gets even bigger. From a futures perspective, we should be concerned about this because a lot of those really big businesses are in the rent-seeking business. A lot of them fall under that platform economy, and the platform economy is really a toll-collecting, rent-seeking economy. So we often talk about it in the other direction, where we talk about the platform economy as being part of the sharing economy. But the flip side of that is that bigger corporations own a bigger chunk of the global economy. I think I read recently that the FAANGs, that would be your Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Google, are now contributing over a quarter of the value of the United States Stock Exchange. That's a huge imbalance between the biggest businesses and the smallest ones. And unfortunately, what we're seeing right now is that lockdowns and economic constraints are really cutting that middle segment out of the market. Once again, creating a divide between the biggest and the smallest. The second way I look at this is from a classic inequality perspective, the growing divide between the rich and the poor, the increasing pressure on that middle segment of the market. Your traditional middle class, or as I like to call it, the trading or the codependent class, these are the taxpayers who work, sell their time for a living, or trade, run a small business for a living. And this segment of the market has been particularly hard hit by the global economic constraints. This is the segment of the market that is not getting easy access to bailouts. This includes your freelancers, your small businesses who don't qualify for income support in many countries, who have to find their own way to make it through the segment. They're at risk of falling down into the dependent class, the people that are reliant on welfare in order to pay their bills, in order to collect a living wage, which is really a tragedy, because a strong democracy and a strong society has more people with reciprocal skin in the game, has more people that benefit from the upside and the downsides of your economies. When your middle class is under threat, we can see what happens. We can see the riots going on across the world. I think there's a huge vulnerability there for us, forgetting about how important having a functional middle class is in a world where inequality is growing. We've already seen with those helicopter money drops that a lot of countries have done to try and placate people as they are not able to work due to lockdowns. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is they're just increasing that inequality once again. A lot of that money is going to big businesses and your wealthiest segments of the population, and the middle class, for a large extent, has been left behind, with many people not even qualifying for those sorts of handouts. For me, that's quite a tragedy. I think we need middle class to have a strong society going forward. And then the third aspect, I look at it from an economic perspective, is the growing divide between younger and older generations, and what that means for the social contract that we really have in our societies. Particularly in Western developed nations, we have this social contract where younger people need to pay into social welfare nets to support older people. It's a sort of spend it in advance type of system, in that people are spending money that future generations then have to pay into. And we're starting to see that breakdown as we see that younger people are realizing that they're simply not going to have access to the same funds that they are currently funding for older generations. Of course, the current health crisis has highlighted these divisions, because unfairly so, but it is the way it is, older people are disproportionately affected by the health effects of this crisis, but at the same time, younger people are disproportionately affected by the current and future economic effects of this crisis. Not only are younger people walking into a world where they're not going to be able to find as many jobs or earn as much money, they're also going to be the generations going to pay back all the bailouts that are currently going into keeping our society ticking over. So once again, we've already seen from a trend and futures perspective that there is growing conflict between different generations and different generations' priorities. And this is something that's happened not just because of the crises, not just the unfairness in a lot of our social contracts, but also because people live on us. You've got more generations competing for national budget share. So it's creating a much more complicated situation going forward. And once again, if we're not able to find middle ground between those generations, we are creating a much more fragile society and a much less resilient society going forward. So my challenge to individuals, organizations, and nations would be to try and rebuild that middle ground between big and small, between rich and poor, between the old and the young. We need to find a balance between dealing with the urgent and dealing with the important. We need to find a balance between a high time preference and between a far future mindset, where we can start to really improve the life cycle consumption smoothing between different generations and between different strata of society. If we want a resilient future, we really do need to work on building our middle ground. Thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Bronwyn. Just to remind people, if you want to pose a question, then please do so using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you want to chat to the other delegates on the webinar today, then do use the all panelists and attendees option on the chat screen. So don't forget, if you want a question, the Q&A box. If you want to chat with your other delegates, then I'd suggest all panelists and attendees. So thank you very much, Bronwyn. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions and discussion later on. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Bruce Lloyd. Bruce is his chapter is entitled A Case for New Progressive Socially Focused Economic Initiatives. Bruce is Emeritus Professor of Strategic Management at London South Bank University. So Bruce, the floor is yours. Thank you.
I hope you can hear me okay.
We certainly can.
Great. Well, we've heard many times this phrase, don't waste a good crisis. And in many situations, the Chinese, I think, use the word opportunity as the other side of a crisis. And this is a horrendous crisis, such as we haven't known for decades. And there is an urgent need to recognize that it's also an enormous opportunity to take new initiatives or accelerate existing ones that can help us move to a more sustainable new normal. To start with, of course, we need clear objectives. And that concept of a more sustainable society is a very good one to start with. And the role of strategy is to try to put together a wide range of initiatives that end up reinforcing each other and generally help us move in the right direction. As in almost all areas of strategy, there are no perfect answers, and you can't do everything, so you do need priorities. And my chapter contains a number of suggestions. Most of them aren't new, and many of them have been covered by others' contributions in the book and today's sessions. Many are already happening, but we need more of them and much faster implementation. Together, they should help us move in that more sustainable direction. Although they're mainly focused on the UK, I think the basic approach is relevant globally. In essence, I believe there is the need to combine the concept of the Marshall Plan, which looks at restructuring some of the financial aspects of the crisis that we're in, with a new beverage plan, which came out of the original one came out of the Second World War in the UK, which emphasizes positive, social focused priorities. This social focused agenda should of course start with giving much greater recognition to the value of health service and other essential workers, as well as greater concern for all the other disadvantaged members of society, and that includes trying to deal much more seriously in the so-called prosperous parts of the world with the homeless situation. And this is increasingly going to involve the need for more investment and higher salaries, probably, in the health and environmental sectors, particularly investment in trying to cope with climate change, which has not been sufficiently emphasized, I think, in our discussions. And it's going to be needed, we're going to need to combine this investment with probably less investment in areas such as military indulgences, which result in us spending hundreds of millions of pounds per new fighter aircraft, which I think many of these priorities will have to change in the future. In the UK, and I think possibly in other parts of the world, we've had a considerable emphasis on high-speed trains, where we really need a greater emphasis on the quality of the travel experience rather than just speed. We need to move away from the obsession that we have with GDP as a measure of societal success. GDP is a quantity measure, and it isn't a quality measure. And we need to be much more focused on the value of social progress indicators. We need greater emphasis on the importance of relationships, values, and wisdom. And in that context, just following on from a comment that was made earlier, wisdom isn't just the ability to admit that you make mistakes, but it's an ability to recognize that mistakes are invaluable learning opportunities. And that's really how we make progress in society, by learning from our mistakes. In fact, the whole of the educational system is designed to try to pass on the experience of others who've made mistakes. We also need a much greater emphasis on social enterprises rather than on the materialistic obsessions that we have that focus on short-term profits and making more and more money and playing with it in the financial markets and the accumulation of things. We need to be more concerned with long-term purpose and much more concerned with responsible, compassionate capitalism. If we don't get that compassion into capitalism, I think that many of the predictions that Marx made a century ago are likely to come to the surface again, if they're not very near the surface already. In this context, we need much greater transparency, including further squeeze on tax havens, if not their total abolition. We need to have less emphasis on arrogant, opinionated, egotistical, authoritarian leadership, so-called leadership styles, and in its place, a much more collaborative approach that recognizes purpose and relationships and evidence is much more important than personalities and prejudices and short-term politics. Such a move, especially when combined with the other items mentioned, should help improve the level of trust in society. And that is a critical factor that will improve relationships all round. Governments need to try to move beyond day-to-day politics. And I think actually there is a dimension that much of the media needs to take responsibilities as well, in order to focus not on just dealing with the immediate crisis and how we phase out lockdown, but how to move to a new and better normal, which would involve a significant shift in our economic and social priorities in a more sustainable direction. What is really needed is, for all countries, is a post-pandemic new normal manifesto. Of course, it's going to be unrealistic to expect everybody to 100% agree with everything, all the details of such a program. But reaching round about 80% relatively quickly would be more than sufficient as a basis for action and progress in the immediate future. And one critical point in concluding here is that we desperately need to see a significant improvement in the quality of the conversations that take place over these initiatives. Again, trying to avoid personalities, prejudices, and short-term politics. In some ways, the crisis appears to be fostering a new level of global cooperation between experts and professionals, although not necessarily between politicians. And the situation in the US is, of course, has been mentioned already, both particularly horrific and extremely worrying. In addition, this new technology will accelerate both general learning as well as many other activities, including those focused on researching global social and health needs. Overall, there are plenty of other areas where the development of detailed initiatives and policies can be integrated into a coherent strategy, as well as detailed priorities for action. And again, although the suggestions that I've made are primarily focused on the UK, many, if not all, the points are generally applicable worldwide. And such an approach would help reassure us that we're not wasting this crisis. It's extremely unlikely that we're going to get another crisis and opportunity like this for decades. And such an agenda will help us all move to a better, fairer, more sustainable world. And the chapter that I got in the book ends with a couple of questions. What should be included in this package? I feel I've just scratched the surface of this. And how can we make them happen as quickly as possible? Because unfortunately, I don't really think time is on our side. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you very much indeed for that, Bruce. So let me just do this. That should be me. Excellent. So that's two of the four chapters that we reviewed, three, sorry, of the four chapters. What I forgot to mention at the top of the piece was that Rohit will also be talking about a chapter that the Fast Future team have put together entitled Reshaping the Economic Agenda. So Rohit, welcome to the floor. The floor is yours.
Sorry, just having an issue here. Zoom doesn't think I'm unmuted. Well, thank you very much. Fascinating presentation so far. We've had the pleasure of reading this book several times over in putting it together, and just every time you hear the authors talk about their contributions, you learn something new, you develop a new insight, a new idea about the topics they've covered. In our chapter then on Reshaping the Economic Agenda, we looked at what we thought were 5 really critical areas in which we need to focus in order to move significantly from where we are and the challenges we face today to a more inclusive, a more robust global economy. And I'm going to just pick on 2 because I think they're 2 critical areas. The first is around country viability. We knew before we went into this crisis that a number of countries were on the brink or pretty much over the brink in terms of their economic viability, their ability to provide sound infrastructure, a quality education system, a robust healthcare environment, and support for the citizens at every level. And whether that's because of conflicts or simply because they haven't had the economic resources to move forward, there have been a number of countries in that state. This crisis is going to tip a number of those countries over to the point where we're looking at 20 to 30 years of economic instability and potentially just pure bankruptcy for a number of those nations. So the question is, what do we do about it? Because again, this is an airborne virus that travels on planes. While any country is unstable, that's incredibly bad news for the citizens of that country. Just from a purely humanistic perspective, we need to be thinking about how do we provide an environment where everyone can flourish. But secondly, from a self-interested point of view, economic instability, a lack of economic opportunity at home leads to migration. It leads to refugee crises. It leads to the risk of the pandemic spreading and never really coming under control. So there's a real requirement there to come up with new ideas, new thinking about how do we support those countries. A lot of donor nations have got weary of giving money to countries where they feel there's not enough control over how it's spent or the implementation of the projects that are supposed to be delivered. There's a feeling that there's a lot of inefficiency all the way through the system, and we need new models. Now, whether that's as simple as countries merging and just saying that that we're too small individually to do all the things we need to do to move forward. So maybe 4 or 5 neighboring countries look at the idea of merging. And that's come up a few times in Africa. So that rather than having 5 economic ministries for countries with 1 to 5 million people, you have one that covers the whole territory. Similarly, 1 education ministry, 1 policing authority, 1 infrastructure authority. So you can use your resources more effectively and plan for a bigger group of people to get them to a stage of economic viability. A second idea is, do these countries effectively put themselves up for adoption? Whether that's to governments of other nations to find a benign partner who will effectively guide them through, or even to the corporate world. And as an anathema as that may feel, it may be that that's the only route, that countries have to trade what they have, whether it's resources, whether it's human resources, whether it's their future potential, in return for long-term corporate support. And another model could be that the donor countries do come together again and put the money up, but now it's channeled through both the World Bank or IMF as the funders, or the Asian Development Bank or whoever, but they also have a country partner who effectively helps them develop capabilities, develop capacity, trains up their government, trains up their civil society infrastructure, helps them build more robust systems in every area, and really partners them on a one-to-one basis so that you have job exchange, you have a lot of sharing of knowledge and expertise, but there's a much closer monitoring, a much closer support relationship with a particular country that takes the lead on guiding you through. And I'm not going to name individual countries here because people will kind of jump into that and say, no, you shouldn't do that to XYZ. But that's one piece. The second area that I think is a really important topic that we've picked on is how do you do national economic development plans now in this new environment? In the last 10 years, we've seen a number of nations in the Middle East, in Asia, in Latin America, and some in Africa lay out these longer term roadmaps, these 2030, 2040 visions. And sometimes they are just a series of aspirations. Sometimes they're really well informed by some quite robust foresight work to understand the world we might be moving into and then lay out the agenda for what they want to create for their people. These are quite exciting because they give a direction, they give a focus to investment, they give a focus to inward investment initiatives, they give a focus to capacity building and education. A lot of these have been heavily disrupted by the downturn and by the pandemic that drove the downturn. And so the question is, what do we do next? And we argue that you need to start thinking about those national economic development plans in 3 stages. The first stage is really about the next 2 years, which is about building domestic capacity, building up your resilience mechanisms so that you don't get shocked again by the next crisis, building up local capability in things like small footprint manufacturing, so whether that's 3D printing or other technologies, so that you can manufacture what you need at the local level. And we're seeing this happening now with cars and all sorts of goods, that you can now produce at very low volumes in these small footprint factories. It means bringing food supply domestically. So that's looking at things like saltwater agriculture, vertical farming, all sorts of forms of hydroponic agriculture, so that we can become more self-sufficient locally and not reliant on global supply chains. And then the other piece of that is doing the R&D now for the things that we might be building and creating in the next period and the period after that. And for us, the next period is that sort of 3 to 5 year period where really you're building on the results of the R&D done previously to start building the new industries, to start building new businesses in the fields of science and technology that you were researching in the first 2 years, building up domestic infrastructure, transforming education systems, governance systems, and civil society infrastructure, and really laying the foundations then for the next period. Because that next period is where some of the most transformative stuff happens with science and technology. That 5 to 10 year period is where you start to see things like Hyperloop, driverless vehicles, next generation artificial intelligence, all start to come through, and a range of these exponentially advancing abundance technologies. But you have to lay the foundations for that. So we see this as a very much a staged, structured plan to take us from where we are today to a sort of sustainable roadmap, which puts countries in a much stronger footing and allows them to deliver on these long-term visions because they've got the right infrastructure in place. So that's probably all I'm going to say about this chapter, but it was one of the ones we enjoyed writing most because it really gave us a chance to explore what a truly revitalist or revitalized economic agenda could look like. Back to you, Steve.
Thanks very much indeed, Rohit. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a series of discussions. As I've said earlier on, if you want to put a question to the panel, then please do so using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. I have a list of questions that I'm going to pose anyway, but I actually wanted to start this session by giving you a poll. to think about. So you'll see the poll on the screen. What are the biggest societal priorities today in your country? And you can, it's multiple choice, so you can select as many of those as you want. So mental health and well-being, a more responsive and socially connected policing model, removing inequalities in and between nations, accelerating the economic and social development of the poorest nations, and universal basic incomes and services. And whilst that people are filling in that poll, there's one question that came to my mind that I'd like your perspective on, and whoever wants to go first, please do. And one of the things that it particularly struck me about all of the ideas that you were talking about is how did democratic cycles actually make it harder or easier to implement some of the ideas you're talking about?
I'll go.
Bronwyn,
I
thank you.
definitely think that democratic cycles, as they're currently set up with the sort of 4 or 5 year time frame, definitely push us towards present bias, and they definitely encourage us to discount the future. Chasing the next election cycle as opposed to necessarily investing in policies that are best for humanity in the long run. And like I usually like to say, is that your government has a much shorter time horizon than you do. You will be alive for a lot longer than your current government will be in power for. So the incentives just don't align between what a government is supposed to do and what individual citizen should be advocating for. And I think that there are ways to solve that problem. I think in particular, we need to get more younger people engaged with the democratic process. The alternative is a social breakdown, is what we've seen. Whether you look at the protests going on in the United States, in my countries, or really all over the world, we've seen a huge wave of youth-driven protests because young people don't feel they're able to use democratic means in order to get their voices heard. And this is a huge problem. There are solutions to that. We're starting to see some governments across the world actually implementing ministerial portfolios focused on the future. And that helps parliaments and governments to be reminded of the long-term consequences of their actions rather than the old sort of overpromise, under-deliver cycles we perpetually get ourselves into based on our current 4 or 5 year election cycle framework that we painted ourselves into a bit of a corner with.
Sure. Bruce, have you got a perspective on this?
Mine is slightly different in that I'm more concerned with mechanisms for increasing transparency and ensuring that the power that exists within government is more responsibly used. And I think that that is a major issue around the world, and making sure that we don't have a political agenda that is ego-driven by individuals, and it's not being driven by a responsible concern for the wider interests of society.
Rohit, what's your view?
I think we're actually reaching the point where we need to separate the government role of setting a sort of political and almost spiritual direction from a country from the developmental agendas. So whether it's education, environment, infrastructure, you know, those things need a 5 to 20 year time horizon to really make something stick, to make it sustainable. You can't keep chopping and changing your education model. You know, it just doesn't work, and the kids are the ones who suffer. You can't build infrastructure on the basis of 5 year electoral cycles. You need to think about what do we need for 2030, 2050, or whatever. And you need to, I think, bring these out of the normal modes of government and have almost independent bodies that are running these on as commissions on behalf of governments. Governments might come in and say, you know, we'll fund you, or we won't fund you, or we'll, you know, we want you to accelerate. But I think governments are much more there for about, you know, the spirit of the nation and the overall direction and philosophy. I don't think that the things we're trying to do now with education, with infrastructure, with healthcare, they transcend political divides. You need to have them. And I think we need new mechanisms. What I think is interesting, if you take the chapter we wrote about the national economic development plans, then when you look around, most of the countries that have anything more than a 10-year economic development plan tend to effectively be single-party states. You know, they're either Emirates in the Middle East, or they're countries where effectively there's, you know, like Singapore, where the same party's effectively been in power for a long time, so it feels like it has the confidence to do that. Now, I'm not arguing for that as a model, but it is interesting that where the government feels like it has continuity, it has the capacity to lay out an agenda, then you see these more ambitious long-term storytelling projects, if you like, about what kind of nation we want to become. Now, I hope that we find a new model for Western society and for Western democracies. Hope is probably stronger here than the evidence base, because so many people like the idea of being in power for power's sake, rather than what Bruce is, you know, talking about in terms of power really being a metaphor for responsibility. So, you know, that's my concern, that not enough people see it as a responsibility. They see it as a reward or an opportunity to advance their own agenda, whether it's personal or, you know, political. And we need a shift away from that. We've got a more intelligent workforce, thank God. You know, we've got a more intelligent population. More and more people are, you know, getting good quality education. They're thinking for themselves and they're seeing that the system doesn't work. You only have to look at the UK election and how uncertain it was even up until, you know, the day before the election as to which way it would go, with radically different agendas. So, you know, populations now are voting much more on what do I want to see happen than what political views do I align with, because the political views are sort of merged to some extent. Very long answer to say, separate out the big development stuff from the political.
I'm going to give people a little bit more of an opportunity to vote on the poll, but that's just kind of a cover, because I wanted to lead on from that question. Because one of the things that started to strike me is you were all talking about sort of a merger between mindset, attitude, behaviors at the kind of the national, the political level. But then what that started me thinking was, what's the nature of the conversations that we need to have to change the behaviors at the individual, at the population level? Because, you know, going back to what you said just then, Rohit, there's this kind of connection between the messages that appeal to certain members of the population that drive out a particular political answer. So what is it that, you know, how do the conversations need to change so that we can inform mindset to create a different political outlook, do you think?
I'll go quick. Oh no, go.
I think that there has to be a reckoning between, or a revolution amongst individual citizens that have to both be inspired to want to be part of dictating their own destiny rather than having a destiny imposed upon them by a political sphere, but also to feel that they are able to facilitate change. There has to be this reciprocal skin in the game. There has to be upside and downside risk that is matched to both the political players and the citizens that benefit from it. And I think one of the more encouraging things, I know we've had a lot of bad news this year. 2020 has just been the gift that's kept on giving us curveballs and surprises. I think we need to raise our eyes a bit, as I was saying, to think a bit further forward about the longer term game that we're playing. And of course, the SpaceX launch is for me a beautiful metaphor of how you can use the private and public sector together to look at those bigger term visions. And I think that we forget that government's role should be to govern. So in other words, to do things. Government's role doesn't necessarily have to be about planning, you know, going through those 10, 20-year planned economies, which we know from history don't always exactly work out as planned. I think the preceding century to our own really showed the failures of some of those trying to impose a plan on society. But I think that we need to find more of, as I was saying, a middle ground between public and private sector, allowing both aspects to focus on what they're good at. You know, because a private sector company automatically has a longer term horizon than a current politician currently in power. So we need to harness those two respective sets of strengths and weaknesses. And if we can find more ways to work together, we can, you know, build a better future there. But this does involve individual citizens showing their agency. to come at it from a slightly different perspective, also looking at some of the more successful future governance systems that are already actually in play. I like to use the example of Taiwan and the very interesting things they're doing there to exactly do that, to get more involvement from the citizenry involved in political decision making that affects individuals, harnessing new technologies, but also finding ways to collect middle ground once again, rather than focusing on polarizing, because that's the other problem with party politics. The democratic system of the West encourages people to form parties in order to accumulate power, and parties come with baggage because you're collecting a bouquet of ideas that might actually be conflicting. I love to look at the conflicts in the different bouquets in the two teams in the United States, for example. It's quite funny when you look into that. But those platforms like what Taiwan has developed, where they get people to focus on the commonalities rather than the differences, by getting people to vote on policies, to get citizens not just voting for a person, but to actually vote on policy, because we can do that with technology now. We start to get a much more exciting future, and we can get younger people excited about participating in politics, where they don't feel like it's just putting an X on a page every 5 years, then having to sit back and see what happens and accept the outcome, and whatever the top down then wants to implement happens. So I think there are ways to do it. We need to be having the conversations, and we absolutely can't be continuing what we do presently into the future, because democracy as we currently have it doesn't seem to be able to scale or to sustain itself.
Interesting. Thank you, Bronwyn. Bruce.
Well, just three quick things. One is, I think either implicitly or explicitly, Rohit was arguing for the need for electoral reform in the UK, where the highly polarised system does create some special problems over the institutions that he's talked about that don't seem to apply so much in Europe, where they have a much more consensual approach to political parties getting together, and therefore the other issues have to be planned separately over the longer term. And in that context, it's, I think, very noticeable in the UK, at least, that the highly politically driven initiatives are usually the ones that work out wrong. They work out, in the end, they are out of touch with the realities of what is going on, because the individuals concerned have been pursuing them from their own political prejudices. But one final point of optimism, in a way, I hope, and we've got to build on this, is that the sympathy and even enthusiasm for healthcare workers, for volunteers, for all those groups in society which actually run into many millions, that have kept the country going because they believed in the importance of keeping the country going, are the people that we've got to build on that sort of spirit, rather than the spirit of the speculators and the other operators that were really being driven by trying to just make a short-term profit out of things.
Yeah. Rohit, what are your thoughts?
Well, I had three. Bruce has talked about one, which is the need for electoral reform. I think that's absolutely essential to get people feeling like their vote has more influence. I would actually be more draconian. I would go down the Australian route of making voting compulsory. Because I really think it's a responsibility. It's not just a right. I think, we have a responsibility. The second thing I think is that, we spent 4 years arguing about having a referendum, and then, 5 years afterwards arguing about the result, because we're just not used to doing referendums in the UK. So we did something that was the most complex decision, where all of the decisions were rolled into one in or out vote. Whereas, countries like Switzerland have a referendum, on a very regular basis. The citizenry are used to voting about, whether they have a guaranteed basic income, what happens to church steeples. They have a lot of say on a regular basis in their cantons and nationally. And I think And that's how you get people more involved, is teaching us how to be part of the process. And then the third bit, I think, is this is something that we've tried with group dialogue processes in the physical world. And sometimes they work. You know, you can, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in some places got to understand different perspectives, but they didn't sustain, and you can't bring everyone together. But now we're seeing with technology, platforms that allow you to hear everyone's voice and to build that kind of common ground understanding, you know, what Taiwan's done a lot of, so that you can at least understand difference and understand how you get to more of an engaged and supported decision, because you understand all the perspectives. And I think all of those are critical. The other is, I guess one extra one is, I think we wasted an opportunity in the UK, and I don't know elsewhere, but when we handed out furlough money to 8 million plus people, I think we should have tied that to a kind of compulsory education requirement to say, in return, you know, you're not working 40 hours a week now. Please spend X hours, whether that's 10, 20 or whatever, learning some stuff. And we don't care what you're learning, but just learn some new skills, because there's a damn good chance that when you come off furlough, you won't go back into that job. And, you know, the world is changing, new industries are emerging. Let's use this as an opportunity to raise people's digital literacy, their emotional literacy, and their understanding of a changing world, so that they're far better positioned to go after the new jobs that emerge.
This has really opened up. I've got a whole bunch of things going through my head at the moment, but we're going to look at the poll first. Otherwise, we'll spend between now and 10 o'clock talking about this, and I'm sure not everyone wants to do that precisely at the same time. So this is what the poll told us. It's a fairly even spread there, but in terms of the biggest societal priorities today, mental health and well-being, and a more responsive and wholly and socially connected policing model were the two that came out, but not much to choose between any of those really. Any of the panel, what are your comments on those poll results? What surprises you? What doesn't?
For me, they kind of mirror the fact that we're split in society about what's important. You know, it kind of reflects the fact that we have such diverse views. And maybe if we'd spent time debating each one, they would have all got a much higher score, you know, and explained more. But yeah, it kind of just mirrors the fact that we have such diverging views across society about what's important now.
They're all important issues, so I would be surprised if any of them had been left on the table blank. So it doesn't. The results don't surprise me too much. I would say that we do need to look at all of those points.
Yeah, can I just reinforce that in many of the polls, the key thing is to recognize that actually you can do an awful lot of them at the same time. They're not real alternatives. And if we really want to make progress in a lot of these areas, you've got to get a lot of things moving in the same consistent direction. And they might be relatively small things, but they reinforce each other.
I think you've got a few questions in there as well now, Steve, haven't you?
We have. I'm just looking at one now. So Brent Garland has asked a question. I mean, he did say afterwards that he thinks that it's sort of started to be answered, but let's pose the question anyway. When we have such a separation of interests by generational forces, so economic, political, and so on, what strategies are there for forging consensus or at least an inclusive policy agenda? And as he said, he thinks that we've started to address that, but is there anything else that that the panel can think about that will help forge consensus?
Well, I think it comes back to what I was saying earlier. There has to be a reciprocal skin in the game. There has to be risk and reward on both sides of any sort of divide if you want to move forward together. You can't feel that one generation is having to carry the weight of another. It has to be equitably split. And unfortunately, we're not going to get that unless we get more younger people actually engaging in the political system. So you really have to do that. But I think it also is related to the point that Rohit was talking about, like tying that furlough money to some sort of responsibility, because with every right has to come a responsibility. So when you look at any side of the social contract, that's what we need to be aiming towards. And concerns, I know we haven't spoken about it too much today, about the sort of glib promotion of universal basic income as a solution for all the world's problems, in that what it does really separates populations between net beneficiaries of the system and net contributors to the system, but without necessarily having reciprocal responsibilities on both sides of that divide. And I suppose that's why some of these sort of future band-aids that I love to see thrown around perhaps need a little bit more thought about those unintended consequences that come a bit further down the line by separating rights from responsibilities. And I think that if we can merge that together a bit more, we'll go a long way to improving the sort of policies that we put in place from an economic and political perspective.
Yeah, maybe we should be calling it a guaranteed training income.
I'd go for that. It's got to be a give and take.
It's a stopgap measure. I don't think guaranteed incomes are the way forward for the next 20 years, but I think they probably are a mechanism that can help us get through this kind of nasty period of the next few years where we're recovering from this recession. We're then going into a technology-induced recession as more and more jobs disappear to tech. And before the next waves of employment come, we have to retrain people. And you can't take someone from being, let's say a cabin steward at BA to being a lab scientist at a biotech company, or, being a lawyer to being a nanomaterials researcher. It's not an easy transition. We need to do some work with them. So I think we need those retraining mechanisms, and I think training is at the heart of this agenda going forward
now. Just a couple of points. First of all, I strongly agree with Bronwyn. I think it's quite a pity that we never had a Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities, and it's interesting to work out why they didn't go down that road. And I think the reason why they didn't go down that road is that all the responsibilities would attach to the people who had power, and they didn't want that particular dimension highlighted. And so we've ended up with this separation. But just another area, in following on from the question, I think, unfortunately, a lot of the media, when they address a lot of issues, including things like Brexit, they just want people on the media who are going to have a good argument, conflict with each other, because that's good media presentation. Whereas what you really need in a lot of these areas is to get people round a table with some flip charts and to say, well, what is it that we are looking for in the future, to try to get them out of their boxes into thinking about not where they're coming from, but where they want to go and what it is about the future that is important to them. And that, unfortunately, that process doesn't get onto Newsnight or Panorama, which is where we end up by seeing a lot of these subjects getting into incredibly meaningless, polarized debates about getting back control without anybody really discussing what that really means.
I think based on your definition, Bruce, there's a risk there that given the degree of agreement at this particular forum that we might be considered bad media, but I don't think that's right. I think this is great media. There's one thing that you started to touch.
I hope we can get on to Newsnight.
Yeah, we'll take over the world. One of the things that did struck me, particularly about what you were saying then Bruce, is we've spoken about what some of the enabling things might be to help this debate along in the future. But one of the questions actually that you posed at the end of your chapter was about the barriers, and the question you raised was, what are the main barriers to implementing a progressive and socially inclusive global recovery agenda? So if you were posed that question, how would you answer that?
I think I try hard to avoid a glib answer, which is probably means I'm going to give one. And that is the non-answer, that it'll depend on which part of the world you're in, because how you address these issues is going to be very dependent upon the different countries and that you're dealing with. And if I can just for 1 minute address an issue that Rohit was discussing, one of the things that I've been arguing, you'll see it on the link that you've got at the end of my bio, I did some work on trying to get people to discuss the issue of how governments add value to society. And it's amazing how the establishment doesn't want to discuss that. But to try to focus on whether at what level, why is it that we're taking decisions at particular levels, whether it's national, local, or international, is actually the critical factor in beginning to get some of these arguments put onto a more sensible plane. And while I think that there is an argument for bigger countries, there is also an argument for showing that the smaller countries, New Zealand, Iceland, I happen to come from a little island called Guernsey, that's done pretty well in trying to deal with this crisis. And so that is, we've got to try to get a better debate going about how governments can really, at all levels of society, help add value to society as a whole.
And Bronwyn, what's your perspective? And I'm particularly interested in your perspective, given you are our representative from outside the UK, and you know, South Africa and Africa generally is just so different to what we're used to seeing each day. So you know, so how would you respond to that question? What are the barriers to implementing progressive, socially inclusive, you know, policies and ideas?
Well, I suppose my answer might be a little bit uncomfortable, and I think that there's a lack of trust is the first. There's also a lack of confidence in the electorate, and I think that is holding us back from calling our power to account. Because African nations throughout history, not pre-colonization, post-colonization, unfortunately, Africa is a continent where populations have been completely taken advantage by bad leaders for generation after generation. So there's first of all a confidence issue that we have to get past as voters to say that we actually do have rights as citizens and that our governments actually do need to be called to account, that they're not there to rule us, but they're rather there to serve us. And I think that's a mindset attitude. But that's an aside. I think the bigger point really is that trust is everything, and that all societies are based on trust, just like individual relationships are based on trust. And trust is very difficult to build, but it's very easy to destroy. And I think that what the current crisis has definitely exposed us to in South Africa, where I live, and I think looking globally, I think there's a similar story out and playing across most of the world, is that it's exposed this huge lack of trust between citizens and their governments. And unfortunately, this is a vicious cycle, it spirals out of control. So the government doesn't trust the citizenry to behave well, to wear masks, to avoid closed places, to just behave like responsible adults in their own right. And because of that, they impose draconian laws. And the more draconian and the more petty the laws are, I mean, like to give you an example from my own country, my government put out a list of what types of clothes people were allowed to buy online. And one of the items in that list was crop bottoms may only be worn with leggings. Like no one even knows what a crop bottom is, but that's how petty the list of laws and legislations were being dished out to the citizenry. And when your government shows that little amount of faith in its own citizens to even be able to choose appropriate attire for the weather, of course, that population then trusts the government even less and in fact rebels against those laws. So as we say, when it comes to governing complex systems, simple solutions are the best, and simple laws actually enhance trust and encourage good behavior. And it very much does go both ways, because if citizens aren't able to act responsibly in and of themselves, draconian laws will be imposed upon them by citizens. And I think snapping out of those trust cycle spirals is probably the biggest barrier to building healthier societies at the end of this. I don't have a great answer for it, but I think diagnosing the problem at least takes us some way to thinking about how we could do better in the future.
Rohit, 60 seconds.
I don't think I've got a lot more to add to what's already been said. I think we're at a point where so many of our systems need to be rethought. So many of our mechanisms need to be rethought. And we need to have some big new conversations with the population about how we get there from here. That requires trust, it requires transparency, it requires real honesty about the forces of change we're facing, it requires real honesty about our finances, and it requires a conversation about, you know, what that mutual responsibility is to each other. Citizen to state, state to citizen, citizen to a citizen, and some big new dialogues about how do we navigate this new world we're moving into where no one has the answer. But we do have tools to get there, which are about dialogue, which are about understanding, which are about a fairer, more inclusive world. But those aren't easy to get people to buy into. You know, if you're winning at the moment, then why would you want to win less? You know, we have to have some very difficult conversations.
Well, Bruce, Bronwyn and Rohit, thank you very much for your insights, and thank you for taking us through your chapters. That was a really good session. Thoroughly enjoyed that. We're now into a short 10-minute break. So thank you once again, everyone on this panel. We won't close the webinar down so that we reduce the risk of any technological issues as you try to sign back in, but we'll be back live with you at 3:10 UK time, so 10 minutes from now. So thank you very much and see you all shortly.
Thank you all, it was excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just another 7 hours to go.
Wow. You're getting the Guinness Book of Records for this.
We'll get the application in.
It's really good fun. I'm enjoying it. So
Yeah, it's brilliant.
It doesn't feel like work. All right, see you later, Bruce. Thanks.
Yeah. Will you take us off into the other link? We don't have to do anything.
We can remove you from this one, but you'll need to use the kind of the delegate only link to relink to the webinar as a delegate rather than as a panelist.
I'll try to find that. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks. Bye.
Hi, Julia. Can you hear us? Hello, Julia. Can you hear us? Can you see us? Can you hear us? Hello, Julia. Can you hear us?
Hey, yeah. Can you?
Great, great. Excellent, good. So we're going to start again in about 5 minutes. Just going to have a quick break.
Yeah.
Nell is here. We just hid her video, but I'm not sure where she is now.
I'm here presently.
All right. Let's just get your video up and check your screen and everything are working now.
It's disabled, but if you can enable it, then I can put it back on again.
Okay, let me see how we do that. Where are you? panelists. Nell Watson, guest. After start video. There you go. Has that worked?
That's worked. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Good to see you. So we can hear you, we can see you. We're all good. We'll start again in, what's the time now? It is 5 past. We'll start in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Right.
See you shortly.
Thank you. Hi, Julie. Hello there.
Hi.
Okay. Okay, you ladies both ready? Excellent. Let's get going then. Well, welcome back to those of you who've been around for the duration, and for those of you just joining us, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. In this session, we have two excellent contributors. Really enjoyed reading their chapters. And firstly, we're going to have Eleanor Nell Watson, and she's going to take 10 minutes or so, just tell us about some of the key ideas in her chapter, which is called Retroshock, A Return to Roots. Over to you now.
Thank you, Rohit. In our modern times, we have often yearned for greater efficiency. However, that's sometimes come at a cost of authenticity or of healthiness, whether that's our physical health or our emotional health. The crisis of our age, or crises, I should say, are likely to create a chain of events, because the pandemic is only one problem. It's likely to lead to some food crises, some geopolitical crises, economic crises, of course. And we will be dealing with the sequelae, the fallout of the situation for a long time. There's a temptation to look at crises as being something very tragic, and often they are to many people on a personal level. But if we look back on historical crises, often they've been the making or the remaking of a society. For example, the catastrophes from the Toba eruption 70,000 years ago seem to have significantly contributed towards our development as a species, helping us to develop language and culture, which was necessary to survive these crazy times that we were living in. We learned how to preserve knowledge between generations, to pass it down so that we could collect knowledge and wisdom over many different generations. We created new traditions, new forms of artwork, new forms of religion and tradition, as well as new social structures. We saw something a little bit similar during the times of the Black Death in the 14th century, when up to 50% of people living in Europe died. That was a time of tremendous sadness and tumult, but it led swiftly to a renaissance, to a new way of structuring society, which was more equitable and more fair, and which broadened the ability for people to participate meaningfully in society, to further echelons of people within society. I believe that we have a great opportunity to evolve through this crisis as well, to relearn some of the things that we've lost as part of the journey of modernization. We are rediscovering the joys of home baking and how nice it is to bake your own bread, perhaps with a little addition of some fruits or vegetables out of one's own garden. We're rediscovering how fun it is to share family meals together, to enjoy the company of a companion throughout one's working day. And perhaps that physical labor is sometimes more rewarding or more enjoyable than our mental labors that we're used to be doing in the offices. I think that these times are helping us to rediscover our roots, to rediscover the essence that drives us as human beings, those things that make life truly worth living, that some aspects of the modern world, industry, marketing, may have previously distanced us from. And in my little chapter, there's a work of fiction essentially, but it's a future retrospective. It's looking back from the year 2083, back upon our times, and trying to explore what comes next for us in our time at this juncture in history, and the opportunities that we have, therefore, to learn to live our lives in a new and better way. I think we have the makings of a catastrophe, a horrible situation that turns out quite nicely in the end with a bit of shakedown. I think we can arise like a phoenix from these crises if we can weather the storm in the meantime. That's the message that I've been pleased to bring to the world through this wonderful book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nell. Let's hand straight over to Julia then to share from your chapter, and then we'll have a chat with the pair of you shortly. So let's put you in the spotlight now, Julia, and off you go. And Julia's chapter was on the theme of how do we prepare for a new way of being? So we think it fits in a very complementary way with the ideas Nell was talking about. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you. So I'm something of an expert on living life with fear. I was born traumatized and spent decades learning how to survive while feeling unsafe. Today, I'm an author, teacher, and therapist specializing in embodied self-authority. And this is the rich way of life I believe we can all benefit from, especially now as we move into this especially uncertain future. Never before in our lives has the rate of change been so big, or the possible outcomes been so diverse. It's very unsettling and confusing. Like the old cartoon characters, we've gone off the edge and are now running mid-air. In this unfamiliar, uncomfortable landscape, our minds are busy trying to work it all out. What is going on? How do we return to the old normality? But there's a lot of information and misinformation out there. What will happen to us? Boom or bust? Chaos or control? Disaster or innovation? We're trying to make sense and certainty from our old cultural and social paradigm of rational logical thought. Analysis, hypothesis, cause and effect, strategy, control, blame, dominance. This old way of being often worked when the world around us more or less stayed the same. We used to be able to simply assume that what had worked in the past would probably work for us yet again. We assumed that how people have behaved is similar to how they will behave in the future. But now, the old world no longer exists. Everything is unpredictable, and the future is radically unknown. We're now in economic depression and high unemployment. Businesses and families are falling apart. There is a crisis of burnout and mental health. How will we survive if there's perhaps even more chaos, fires and floods, internet and electricity failure, water and food shortages, social unrest and collapse? How will we manage without our old identities and possessions, habits and high maintenance survival strategies, without our favorite coffee beans and kind of milk, nail polish or latest phone? In a new, unfamiliar future landscape, will an old way of functioning make any sense? Will it help us to make the right choices, take the right action, move forward in the best possible way? In personal psychology and spirituality, a breakdown often comes before a breakthrough. Breakdown is a strange and challenging process that is ultimately rewarding. It involves great difficulty, fear and pain, confusion and loss, rupture and renewal. We fall into a hole before we transition into a greater wholeness. Now, as the world's old structures and styles are breaking down, I believe we're collectively and individually being invited to break down and break through to something radically new. Let's be honest, the old ways weren't really working anyway. The environment is polluted and people were exhausted and resentful. This is an opportunity for us to make a positive change. We need now to each start preparing ourselves for a very different future, shifting out of entrenched personal patterns into a new way of being, into a new kind of human operating system. This new way of being will enable us to be more responsive to what is actually happening, whatever it is. What does this new way look like in practice? Let's take a breath and sense our body right now. In my chapter, I describe this new way as a necessary shift from ego to soul, from mind to heart and body, and from human-only focus to appreciation of the value and needs of the full spectrum of life on Earth, including all of the other people, the animals, insects, and plants. It's a shift from focusing on money to compassion. We've been shaken up by the strange difficulty of this time. To create a good future for ourselves and for all, we need to practice tuning into our own arising sensations, feelings, and images so we can access our own inner guidance, our instinctual intelligence, our physical wisdom. We need to become more balanced with an attitude of including everything, inside us and outside us, as of equal importance. We become part of the solution when we recognize we are all small parts of one global, interconnected ecosystem. We take care of ourselves when we take care of others and the earth. The future is not here yet. We are the ones who are creating it in the way that we respond, moment by moment, day by day, week by week. We can embrace the uncertainty, learning to move with it rather than fighting and tensing against it. Together, we can create a fabulously fertile future if we can go about it from a newly grounded sensitivity, realizing we live within a much bigger, interconnected, wise, loving, magical whole.
Thank you, Julia. Excellent. So before we open up to Q&A, let's get everyone on screen now for the chat. Before we open up to the Q&A, and I've seen there's a question come in, and I've got a few. We got a little poll, and I'll put that up. Which of these notions do we think would gain most support in society today? And you can vote for more than one, and you as panelists can vote as well. But I'm going to open us up with a question that's come in from one Mr. Steve Wells. And we'll start with you, Julia, as it sort of came up in your presentation, but then take Nell's views on it. What needs to happen to stop us as individuals and organisations grabbing onto the safe and familiar approaches and strategies because they will make us feel better? So how do we develop the courage to go beyond that which we already know, even if we know it doesn't deliver the results we want? Let's start with you, Julia.
I feel like I need a moment to think about it, or can you say it one more time?
Yeah, so the question was, what needs to happen to stop us as individuals and organisations grabbing onto the safe and familiar approaches and strategies because they will make us feel better? So how do we go beyond just always reaching for that which we know, that which seems safe, even if it didn't necessarily work? It was what we knew, it was tried and tested.
I guess that the only way is for us to see that it doesn't work. It doesn't work for us as individuals, and it doesn't work for us as a planet. Yeah, we need to see that, to be motivated by that.
Okay, now.
I think that one of the root causes of these ongoing catastrophes is a lack of understanding systemic risk and a lack of accounting for that as an externality. In economics terms, an externality is when somebody does something which affects an unrelated third party. For example, a negative externality would be something like pollution. Somebody enjoys a warm house or a factory which is making some stuff, but that's creating pollution, which other people are being affected by. And essentially, in the last, let's say, quarter century in particular, we have greatly accelerated the rate at which we have interconnected the world through globalization and globalized long supply chains. Now, that's been a great thing in terms of efficiency, but that has also created a shifted cost or an externality, which is greater fragility. And that is a cost which is now borne by everyone on the planet. It is a cost to the entire economic ecosystem. And that has not been paid for. Essentially, people have enjoyed the benefit of greater efficiency, but without paying for that fragility which has been generated. In my view, this is indicative of one of the greatest tragedies of our age, which is a lack of accounting for these kinds of externalities. And I believe that it's only by properly accounting for externalities in our economic models that we can truly build a sustainable world and a sustainable society and economy. If we can understand the effects that our choices are having upon the environment, upon the social fabric, then we can better understand the effects that people are having upon it. We can better understand the effects of policy, and we can create kind of a lingua franca to help different polarized ideologies to understand each other, because you can frame your issues in ways of, this is shifting a cost upon such and such. And I think that this is one of the greatest missing gaps in our society today. And I've been trying to start a conversation at pacha.org, pacha.org, to collect ideas on how we can do this better and how we can build a more sustainable and happier global ecosystem through better awareness and accounting of externalities.
Totally buy that. And I can imagine that in government departments, the economists are constantly wrestling with negative externalities, and corporations now are used to that language. But what about the everyday citizen? When I talk to my hairdresser, if I ever get to talk to him again, and we talk about taking a flight and, you know, why should he pay an extra climate tax on there? How do I get into the conversation with him about negative externalities in a way that he would understand? And how do we bring that conversation down or out into the level of the everyday citizens? Because I think that's where it needs to happen, because we're the ones that, in a sense, the everyday citizen, the ones who reach for the norm, the safe, and we vote in governments who represent safe more often than radical. How do we get that conversation in there? And Julia, as well, jump in on this one as well if you've got views. How do we get the everyday citizen engaged with these kinds of conversations?
Julia, do you have a comment?
Well, in the first place, I think that there are quite a lot of everyday citizens who are already involved in this conversation. I've had conversations about the climate, you know, with a whole range of people, you know. So, in part, I think it's to do with how people are able to hear such big and scary ideas, because so many people block it out, are unwilling to hear it. There's plenty of information out there, but lots of people just cannot, their mind, they just cannot, are unwilling to, are unable to, for a whole variety of very personal nervous system reasons, are unable to hear it. So I guess the answer in that case comes back to personal healing.
Right. Lisa Lott's just put her hand up to speak. I'm taking you wanted to say something about this?
Yeah, I think first of all, thank you for great presentations. I think an example of making compelling visions of the future that transform society came, we had artists and authors writing about the welfare state, Nordic welfare state, before it actually existed. Then politicians and decision makers got inspired and they moved forward. We are always double as scared for what we're going to lose compared to what we're going to get. And we need to trick that. So we need to make compelling scenarios and visions using, in a way, actually artists and authors to imagine a better tomorrow so that people have a compelling vision to move into. I don't think we can scare them into doing that.
Okay, thank you, Lisa.
I'm inclined to agree with that. I think it's a bit of a shame how dystopian a lot of our science fiction has become. It used to be all about, you know, embracing a bright new future. And then sometime during the 70s and 80s, it took a darker turn. And now positive science fiction is quite rare. And I think that is unfortunate, because it's only by understanding how good the future could be that we are inspired to aim towards it. We have those examples to build upon. And I think there's a risk, conversely, of if everything looks dystopian, then even if you try to avoid it, you can't help but steer into it.
Okay. Oh, Lisa, you just jumped back in. Did you have something you wanted to say there? You're muted.
Just to comment on that, I completely agree again with Neil. I think we have somehow sidestepped artists and authors so that they're not being taken serious. So all we have that has to do with fiction not already there is somehow of less important, of less value. And I think we have the case right now during Corona that we're not taking culture very seriously. That can be cut back. We don't actually need to meet. We don't actually need to gather because it's unhealthy and scary too. So I think it's actually we're standing in a little bit of a tipping point now, where we have to embrace the value that culture also brings to society. It's not just something we do in our leisure time. It is also where we could get inspired to move forward. So I was very inspired by Julia's way of talking to my soul, for instance. And that is not a very scientific approach, but it is very moving. And so there's something in there.
Excellent, thank you. Let's have a look at the polling results, and then we have another question come in. Let's look at what the poll told us. So, which of these notions would gain most support in society today? And it feels that greater care for fellow citizens, slight majority, allowing our heart to have more say. There's not many of us backing that option. It's interesting. How would you react to that, Julia?
Yeah, I would like to, thank you. It strikes me that trying to split it, to divide those options in a way is that kind of old thinking that I was talking about, because they're all part of the same thing. Care for the planet, care for each other, letting our heart have a say, all excellent options, all excellent questions that you were asking. But
and people could vote for all of them as well.
Right, okay, fair enough. But more of all of them are welcome. It's not either or, it's all of them.
But I guess what I'm saying is interesting here is that given that the participants could vote for all of them, somehow the heart isn't resonating with people at the moment. And I guess that, to me, is interesting. The question I would ask you is, how do you think people can go about even starting to reconnect with their hearts? How do people just start that journey? I know it's obvious to you because you're there, you've been doing it, but what are some simple steps? And I'm going to ask the same question of you, Nell, but about reconnecting to the planet.
Well, I guess that the answer is different for each person, because each person is lit up, has a different route back to their heart. So for some people, it will be the planet. For some people, it will be the birds. For some people, it's gardening. For some people, it's their children. For other people, it's art. For other people, it's music. So in a way, it is following what we are naturally drawn towards. And as we follow that, not greedily, not pushing, but as we allow ourselves to move towards and with that, we are making the journey to and with our own hearts.
Excellent, thank you. Nell, what about you? How do we start to make that journey towards that sort of model that you talk about in your chapter, this return to roots? You talked about baking, you talked about some lovely ideas, but what would be one step that you think anyone and everyone could take to just get a little closer to their roots in everyday life?
I encourage everyone to have a go at a bit of a victory garden, to try growing one's own food, even if it's only, you know, a little bit of cress in a pot, you know, hanging out the side of your window, because not everybody has a garden or an allotment that they can make use of. But just to have something green growing away, it helps us to connect with nature, to understand the cycles of the seasons and day and night, etc. Even watching the little flowers expand in the morning and contract at night helps us to understand all of these different elements of nature and how they interconnect. And especially if you can harvest some of that stuff and you know, bring that into your kitchen and make a meal of it, it really helps us to reconnect with the soil and to get away from depending upon processed means of existing, I suppose. I think that's a very fundamental way of getting closer to nature. And it also helps us think about waste in a different way, because then if you're using compost, then that makes you think that this is not something to be thrown away. These grass clippings, for example, that no, this is something useful. These are useful nutrients. I should be returning these to the soil so they can be used again. And perhaps that can help to inform our views upon waste and to realize what a tragedy it is that all of these precious resources are just smashed and dumped in some hole in the ground. And maybe we can do better.
Julia, you wanted to come in on that?
Yeah, I loved all those things. I want to show you my garden here and to add the deliciousness, the special deliciousness of eating food that you've grown in your own garden and picked, and it's alive. But the elements that I really would like to add is about appreciation. So there's a certain humility that is very welcome in terms of appreciating the sun and the rain and the wind and the earth while we're gardening, and it's that will bring the shift that you were asking about earlier to do with love. When we're listening to music, to appreciate the musicians and the, you know, everything that goes into everything that we usually or in the past took for granted and just consumed. There's a vast backstory for everything, and
Thank you. So we have a new question in from one Stephen Wells again. He says, I'm getting a sense that education is a critical component of moving from the past to the future, part of which will be based on compelling traditional evidence, and part of which might be based on foresight and future scenarios. What role should the issues you have both discussed play in new school curricula, and what should they replace in the curricula? So how do we get your kinds of ideas into the school system, and what has to give in order to make space for them? Who'd like to go first? It's a great question.
Well, I guess what needs to give is the notion, or the old notion, of a job for life, and that we need to learn, you know, old information. We need to learn facts and data and memorize it in order to function, rather than, I guess they call them soft skills of being creative and responsive and empathic and present. And also is for us to realize how intelligent, sensitive and powerful children already are, and to encourage their natural, their innate wisdom. I have a 10-year-old daughter, and I'm constantly delighted and amazed by her, as of course many, many parents are. But a shift from needing to squash children to encouraging children, and they will surprise us. They will come up with, I'm sure they will come up with creative solutions.
Excellent.
I would love to see schools focus more on things like farming, practical things like taking care of animals, taking care of plants, maybe even sampling soil and water and understanding what kinds of contaminants might be in there, and air as well. Those kinds of things I think should be included in curricula. And I'm delighted that at this time there's been a tremendous resurgence, naturally, in the idea of homeschooling, and lots more people interested in that, and interested in alternatives to our education system, which has its successes as well as its failures. And I think there's tremendous opportunities now for people to have new tools to assist homeschooling, to have a kind of a hybrid model whereby the kids learn at least part of their learning being self-directed, whereas they can also convene online through these new mechanisms for breakout sessions, if you will, to focus on a specific topic for a while. And I think that's likely to be a great deal more healthier for children, as well as to enable kids to learn at their own pace, not having to be arrested by the lowest common denominator or by disruption in class, etc. And, you know, there's always been a minority of people that have been interested in these techniques or these ways of learning, but everybody has been basically dipped into that for a time. And now we have experienced that actually this can work. And perhaps the children that we assume have lost a year of schooling may in fact be far more advanced in their education and their development of their character than they otherwise might be during this time. And my hope is that this is going to lead to a bit of a renaissance in how we do education, with more learning and less schooling, and far greater alternatives to the existing assumptions about how we do education.
Is there a risk of a social divide there? That those who have parents that will encourage that, who have the space to go into nature, who have the prior socialization to want to go and explore that, will do exactly as you said. But the people who don't have a laptop at the moment, who live in tiny accommodation, stress situation, that they will actually move further backwards, because the others have not only done a bit of traditional schooling, they've also done all this other stuff to get closer to nature and appreciate the slower side. I worry that actually we're going to see a bigger divide, and a lot of people being left behind by the system in this. And I love what you say, but I feel like there's a part of the kingdom that will benefit, and there's an awful lot that will be left behind there. Julia, you look like you wanted to come in on this one.
Well, I also think that there's a great benefit in the children not being pinned to their desk for however many hours a day, and pinned to keep their bodies still. And of course that breeds resentment, because we're naturally made for our bodies to move all the time. And I think that there's a great, the children are learning so much by being free, not only with their play, but being free in their bodies. It gives them that access to that, to their own wisdom in a way that they won't have when they are forced to sit very still. So regardless of background and access to, all the things that you were talking about, just being free from being trammeled, I think, will bring its own benefits.
I hope so. I mean, certainly you see some great models, don't you, from places like Denmark and Finland, where they only have 25% number of chairs and desks as they have pupils, so that they work on the floor, they work outside. The outside of the classroom, the garden outside, is as much part of the classroom as the classroom itself, or they bring in gardens into the classroom, and kids sit around those and work, and they have much more kind of control over their destiny. The way they work is much more focused on self-actualization, making them independent beings rather than economic units of production. But you feel like, how does that broaden out? And it's fascinating to see that Singapore is now taking its lead from Finland on the next model for education there, rather than following the traditional scoring models. I don't want to be negative, but my fear is that in a lot of places we'll go back to a very traditional model. Already we've got the one of the kind of the big buds in education here saying, well, the answer is going to be making those poor kids who come from poorer backgrounds sit through summer school. So not only have we punished them by not giving them an education environment for 3 months, but now we're going, when all their friends are out playing, we're going to make them sit in a classroom. And it just felt wrong. It was the chief inspector of schools. It didn't feel like a very nuanced idea for how you dealt with the situation.
But I have real trust in the human spirit and in the resilience of human beings. And David Bowie and other artists are coming to mind. People from, so-called whatever background you want to say, come out with extraordinary things. So I'm hesitant at dividing the world into two halves, into haves and have-nots, because I think people will find a way.
But isn't the fact that we keep talking about David Bowie or Richard Branson, or list the same 20 people, we talk about the same 20 who made it out. What about the millions who didn't, and live in poverty? And I think it's, for me, I just worry that that's an easy way of kind of saying, well, it's your problem, just do what they did. and you know, tap into your spirit and you'll be fine. And I think we need to do a little more to create the environment for them to be able to succeed, because we haven't done it so far. No.
I think we might potentially see far better education done in schools now, if we're lucky, simply because the bar has been raised by these new kind of homeschool solutions. You know, more people have had more opportunities to try that way of learning and to discover just how successful it is when we give children a little more agency. And as Julia says, we don't chain them to desks for N hours a day. That may make schools change. It may create a bit of a reform of how we do education. And so my hope is it might be a rising tide that tends to lift all boats rather than creating too much of a division. And I think that we will perhaps see a bit of a hybrid model whereby, similarly to how, you know, a lot of people are working from home at least part of the week, maybe we'll see more schooling from home, right? So less of the obligatory show up at school because it's economically useful if your parents don't have to look after you for that time. You know, maybe we'll transition to something a little bit different, more of a kind of a community center aspect where students can come together for a flipped classroom, where they can discuss lessons together that they have enjoyed online. I think something like that is probably the way to go in terms of education, well, especially for slightly older students.
And that's a very positive note on which to end the session, a note of hope and optimism. Nell, Julia, thank you very much for your presentations and for sharing your thoughts so freely in the conversation. Thank you very much. All the participants, we're not going to close the webinar. We're simply going to pause for a little while, for 10 minutes, while we swap over presenters and do everything else that you can do in 10 minutes. So see you back in 10 minutes. So we'll be starting at, what time? I ought to know this really. 4 o'clock UK time. So see you shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.